Hello my friends, this is Pierce from Tales from the Road, and today I'm in my beautiful hometown of Albuquerque, New Mexico. While I thought I would have a peaceful and restful stay here in New Mexico, I have been very disturbed this week. As many of us have seen, the Russia-Ukraine crisis is fully underway. Bombings every day, lots and lots of news, and lots of terrible things happening. Now, as many of you know, I've filmed an entire series in Ukraine. I've also spent a lot of time in Russia and the former Soviet Union. And a lot of people, both through my YouTube channel and through personal connection via Instagram or Messenger, have asked me what my opinion is. So this is my take on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the background, why this is happening. I'm going to let you know what my friends have been telling me on the ground in Ukraine. And I'm going to tell you what my Russian friends have been telling me about their opinion on the war as well. So before you guys write crazy stuff in the comments, I want you to know that none of this is true fact. This is merely my opinion. I'm an American. I don't necessarily have any allegiance to any side. I'm just somebody who really dislikes war, and I would really like to talk about the real facts on the ground and let you guys know what's going on. So this is my opinion. Let's get into it. To start this video off, I will say that I was one of the people who was poo-pooing the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I thought there was no way in hell that Vladimir Putin would decide to invade a sovereign nation and cause immense devastation and suffering to the people in that country, as well as potentially risk the lives of Russian military men fighting in the Ukraine. I was saying from the start that this is probably not going to happen. A lot of the Ukrainians that I'm friends with also said this probably wasn't going to happen. And, you know, waking up to the news that Ukraine had been invaded, that Russia had 200,000 troops on the border that were rushing across via Belarus, via the Russian border, it was terrifying news. It's mostly terrifying because I have a lot of Ukrainian connections. I spent about 3 weeks in Odessa and another week in Kiev, making really good friends there. And I work with a lot of people from Kharkiv, which is a city that's only 45 kilometers from the Russian border, and where many of you have seen probably devastating footage of airstrikes, of rocket launch attacks, of ground fighting, and people hiding out in the subways to avoid the devastation. So the first question I'm going to answer is, why did this happen? What is Putin thinking, and what led to this? It's a really important question that I feel like a lot of people are not exactly sure. So here's my take. So if we look in history, I'm not going to say I'm the excellent historian here, but Ukraine and Russia have always had deep connections. The Russian Slavic speakers who speak that particular type of language come from the Kievan Rus, who some say migrated from the Viking areas about 800, 900 years ago to present-day Belarus, Russia, Ukraine. Many people think that the Russia and Ukrainians come from the same people. They have the same history, and as Ukraine was kind of intermingled with the Russian sphere of influence for so long, Putin really does feel that they have a sort of a heritage claim over Ukraine and that their identity as a national state is invalid. So that's kind of where this starts, in this sort of national identitarianism. When I went to Ukraine, I noticed that they are very patriotic, that there are lots of people flying Ukrainian flags. The government has really gone to major extent to make sure that the nation state of Ukraine, the blue and yellow flag, the Poseidon or the trident symbol is laden everywhere. And since 2014, after the Ukrainian civil war and the Maidan revolution, things have gotten even more nationalist, as parts of Ukraine have been basically falling apart for the last, we can call it 8 years. Ukraine has always been intermingled with Russian affairs. So they were part of the Russian Empire. Kiev was always a very important city within the Russian sphere. And they were also the secondary, I would say the secondary country, the second most important country during the Soviet Union, where a lot of officials from Kiev were working in Moscow and vice versa. So as the Soviet Union fell in 1991 and Ukraine gained its independence, not many people knew what would happen, but we figured that since they were literally the closest countries to each other, besides of course the Belarusians, that we could kind of see a sort of partnership going together. What many people don't know is that Ukraine actually had many nuclear warheads, and Russia, in order to kind of guarantee their independence, basically asked for them to give up their nuclear warheads if they wanted to remain their own nation. So of course the presidents in the 90s gave away those warheads, and they sold off a lot of the Soviet military materials to different countries. There was even a scramble for Soviet-built Ukrainian military weapons that were sold in many different wars, including from Afghanistan to Iraq to the Yugoslavian wars in the 90s. This machinery and this military technology was used all over the place. So Ukraine was really a military hub, and its demilitarization was really the fact, or it was really bolstered its independence in a way. The real division began in the early 2000s as the Eastern Bloc nations like Poland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, a lot of these Eastern Bloc countries that were basically the Iron Curtain, the buffer zone for the Russians, they all joined into NATO. And so what that means is that NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's basically it's a treaty organization led by Western powers and the United States. And the most important part is it influences trade, but it really influences military backing. And basically, if you invade one, let's say Russia wanted to invade Estonia, then 30 nations all under the NATO banner would then protect that country and fight back. So it's a huge military alliance. And to counterbalance that, there was the Soviet Union, which was 13 independent states all wrapped up into the Soviet Union, plus the Iron Curtain of Poland, of those other countries. But as communism fell in those countries, the barrier between NATO and the USSR, now Russia, started to dissolve. And so Ukraine, the whole kind of thing with Ukraine is as Ukraine started moving more towards the West, Russia felt pressure to influence Ukraine politically. So in 2014, Ukraine had, let's say, the beginnings of a civil war or a revolution. Luhansk and Donetsk are two provinces in the eastern part of Ukraine that have a lot of Russian speakers and Russian native people, as well as the Crimea. Now, Russia annexed Crimea pretty much in a bloodless coup, and they created a civil war in eastern Ukraine in those two provinces, and part of it. There's a little bit of doubt on this, but there's a lot of evidence that the Russians were giving ammunition, were giving maps, were giving technology to the Russian separatists that were living in this region, and they were more or less in charge of this revolution in this part of the world. That being said, in Maidan Square in Kiev, they had a very, let's say, Russian-backed president who was really making the country suffer. And in 2014, the Ukrainians rose up. They said, we don't want to be part of the Russian sphere anymore. We want our own self-determination. We don't want a dictatorship like Belarus. We don't want to be under the thumb of Putin. And they ousted that guy. And for the last 8 years, they've had Ukrainian-chosen democratic presidents who represent the Ukrainian nation state. Now, since then, there's been this bolsterization, we can say, of the Ukrainian national identity. Walking around Ukraine, you see many, let's say, military posters, you see military outlets, you see a lot of Ukrainian positive propaganda for the country. It's very noticeable, I will tell you. So obviously this is to push against the people that have been kind of subverting the country in the east, and of course of what happened to Crimea, as Ukraine is a very particular place because while Ukrainian is the national language, many people are Russian, and because they were all in the in the USSR, there are Russians living in Ukraine, there are Ukrainians living in Russian, there are Ukrainians who speak Russian as their first language and have learned Ukrainian, there are Ukrainians who have moved to Russia, spent 25 years there, started a family, and then come back. So these countries are deeply, deeply intertwined, which makes it really hard to understand why two countries that are so alike with so much camaraderie would be on a path to destroying each other. So in 2016, I spent a month in Russia. I lived in St. Petersburg, and then I went to Moscow. I've been all over the Soviet sphere. I've been to Uzbekistan, I've been to Kyrgyzstan, I've been to the Baltic states, I've been to Ukraine, I've been to Georgia. And what I can say is that all of these places are very similar. They were all in the same country for a very long time, but all of them have big differences within culture and with national identities. So the one thing I can say is that Putin is a dictator. No matter what anyone believes, if he's elected, if he's really beloved by the people, I really doubt that. This man manipulates the entirety of his political system. They have a parliament called the Duma. The Duma are basically selected by Putin's party himself, and there's many, I guess, accounts of Putin even sponsoring some sort of contesting party so that it looks like it's a democratic procedure. We know that Russia has been assaulting freedom of speech, freedom of rights, human rights in Russia and around the world for a very long time. And I know people are very critical of me when I say this as an American, as my country does terrible things too. I don't disagree with this, and I think the United States needs to clean up its act abroad. But what I can say is that The United States every once in a while is on the good side, whereas Russia, I don't think they're ever on the side of human rights in any case. So the point is that Putin and his cronies, which are normally oligarchs, are totally in charge of the entire political system, and the people in Russia typically have no idea what's going on within their government, and they also have no say over what happens in Russia at all. So as the story was breaking out, as it happened last Monday, I asked a lot of my Russian friends, like, can you believe what's happening? And a lot of my Russian friends said, literally nobody knew what was happening. And nobody knew what they could do, and they just woke up to this news. There was no preparation, there was no propaganda in the media, there was no information by Putin. It's just they woke up and their country was invading Ukraine, a country where many of them have family, a country where many of them have worked, a country that they have a lot of connection to, whether politically, familially, economically. All they knew is that they were at war. And a lot of my Russian friends, of course, are under 30, under 40. They're disgusted in what they're seeing. And the good news is we're seeing a lot of protests in larger Russian cities, even though they try to, of course, prevent you from seeing it. You see large-scale protests in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, in Yekaterinburg, and in Novosibirsk, the larger cities in Russia. So the fact is that this is really Putin's war. This is not Russians' war. And Boris Johnson, actually, I'm not a huge fan of Boris Johnson, but he came out with a nice thing that says, we understand that this isn't your war, so we're trying not to blame you. So from a Russian perspective, from what I'm understanding from my friends, is that they're not accountable. And a lot of the Russian troops who are in the Ukraine, they also don't necessarily even know what they're doing. They're just following orders that they're getting minute by minute, day by day. And it's really become a problem. As it seems like the insurgency is not actually going as well as Putin had originally planned, which is why he's throwing sanctions around, which is why he's talking about possibly getting his nuclear defense systems ready, because this is not a very popular war in Russia, nor is it a popular war internationally. So what about Ukraine? Well, I have friends all over Ukraine, and I was kind of studying what they would do. I thought they would simply invade from the east. I thought they would take their time to get to Kiev, and I thought they would leave the rest of Ukraine alone. It seems that the Russians actually came from the south, from the Black Sea, came from the east, and came from the northern border with Belarus. And it seems like as they want to destabilize eastern Ukraine and create a Russian sphere of influence, it seems like the main goal at this point is to oust the current president and to create a semi-Soviet, or let's say an old Soviet Union Russian puppet state, and have Ukraine be the true buffer zone for the NATO alliance. Now, Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has come out very strong. He's been posting a lot on social media. He's been saying a lot of different things about defending the country, about we're not leaving. He's come out and said that we're staying in Kiev, I'm not fleeing. Even the mayor of Ukraine came out today and said, I'm going to pick up arms and fight with my city. So the interesting thing is that while Putin wants to destabilize the government in Ukraine, I literally don't think it's possible, as the Ukrainian nationalism is at its height, and as for a country of 44 million are standing up and saying, we're not doing this. So this is the first time we've seen this in Europe, at least in my lifetime, and they're saying this is the biggest ground invasion since World War II in Europe. It's awful. I've been asking a lot of my European friends what's going on, and what I can say in my own opinion about Ukraine is that they have been sort of left on an island, as they are the buffer zone between the East, the Russian sphere, and West, the American European sphere. And what I can say is that my country, along with the EU and the UN, have been incredibly weak in my opinion. Sanctions are not good enough. I don't think the United States necessarily needs to invade militarily, but recently they started sending more arms, they started sending more money, they started sending munitions and all of that good stuff. But I would say that this really shows that the EU is quite weak, as Russia feels that they're totally capable of invading and destroying a democracy in Ukraine. It shows that the United States government is weak, as if we were more powerful in the region and we were really flexing our muscles, this wouldn't have happened. And it shows you how the UN does not work. The UN has a Security Council, which are the people in charge of the security around the world, and Russia is a standing member on the Security Council as well as the Human Rights Council. I think the UN is a failure. And the reason for this is that the UN can write treaties, the UN can write strongly worded messages, but when it comes down to it, you have countries like Russia and China who clearly do not care about human rights, who clearly care about their own interests, and the UN has no voting power to protect countries at war or countries at risk. And it's sad and it's despicable. I think that, people were coming out, people were condemning, but it was a very slow response. And now I think Russia is starting to feel the pain for what they have just undertaken. As you know, Russia has been put under different sanctions, especially economically, with assets being seized, with banks' assets being seized, with them being taken off of the SWIFT system. But it shows you how fractured the NATO states are, as Germany, Italy were preventing them from being taken off of SWIFT for the first couple of days, as the United States only implemented, let's say, long-term sanctions rather than short-term sanctions. And the fact is that the international community can condemn people as long as they want, but as that's happening, Ukrainians are having their homes destroyed and their country taken over. This is a democracy that voted for their own government, having their right and their sovereignty as a state demolished by a dictator, and we're watching it in real time. If that doesn't frustrate you as a person who enjoys peace, democracy, and world cooperation, I really don't know what does. What I can say is my Ukrainian friends, especially on the Eastern Front, have been completely isolated. They've fled their houses. Over 4 to 5 million refugees have already fled to Moldova, to Poland, to other countries. Russians with American passports, with Ukrainian passports, are not being let back into Russia. This is a huge international crisis. And the difference between this and Syria, because I hear people compare this a lot, is that Syria is a civil war that has become a proxy war between the Russian sphere and the American sphere, where the Syrian people are really not necessarily to blame, but the internal politics of Syria are what's influencing this. This is a ground-scale invasion of a sovereign nation by another sovereign nation over territory that one is disputing does not exist in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians saying that this is our territory, this was what was marked in the agreements and the treaties, and this has been sovereign Ukrainian territory for 30 years. Get the hell out of my territory. This is a whole different ballgame, and it's really nerve-wracking as we see Russia doing this. It leaves me to think, what do these other countries that don't necessarily care about human rights think is okay? Does Pakistan think that they can invade India? Does China think that they can invade Taiwan? Does Turkey think that they can invade Armenia? I don't know. There are a lot of problems within this and a lot of alliances to be made. And I know the Ukrainians are, of course, under a lot of stress and pressure, and it's violent and people are dying and it's scary. But just as that's happening, the Georgians are preparing for an invasion as well, as Georgia is another very conflicted zone with Russia. And it's just really hard to see where this is going to go from here. What I can say is that this is not going well for Putin. As someone who studies international politics and comparative politics, I don't understand why this man would do this to his own country. They've been completely cut off economically. They've been isolated politically. The Russian citizens will suffer. If you don't think the Russian citizens are already suffering, they probably are. Anyone with an international job is screwed. Anyone with an international bank account is screwed. Anyone who depends on the price of the ruble to stay flat is screwed. If I was a Russian citizen watching this happen and my country being completely isolated from the global community right now, I would be fucking livid. I don't understand why this man has done this. That being said, I think in a weird way, this is a last hurrah for Vladimir Putin, as I think if another country doesn't get that guy out of there, I think the Russians probably will. Just as I said, I don't think the Ukrainians would get invaded. I think that Russia is headed towards a really bad path, which is really sad because I really love that country. While the infrastructure is very tight in Moscow and it's very secretive and it's very top-down, very oligarchical, if the oligarchs' assets start getting messed with, if the financial infrastructure of Russia starts to fall apart, I think this is the end of Vladimir Putin. And I really hope so, because the world does not need this dude with a button for nukes any longer. So that is my take on the Ukrainian-Russian crisis. It's devastatingly sad for Ukraine. It's also devastatingly sad for the Russian citizens. It's sad for the world, and it's disturbing. And as a person who thinks it's 2022, we shouldn't be bombing citizens, we shouldn't be hurting people and causing more suffering in the 21st century, this is really sad. I'll end this with a quote that I heard from an old American writer. And she wrote, "When the masters fight, it is the slaves who suffer." And in this case, it really is the slaves, the people, the citizens of these countries who are suffering, watching a tyrant and a democracy deal with each other in a completely negative way. I hope the EU steps up. I hope the US step up. I hope Russia can go fuck themselves right now. And that's my opinion on the situation. If you liked the video, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell. I'm going to do a podcast about this. I'm going to invite some Russians and Ukrainians to talk with me as well, so stay tuned for that. Fuck Vladimir Putin.